They thought they were about to humiliate a quiet woman for their own amusement, but what happened next would haunt their reputations for years to come. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, the marble floors of Holbrook Conservatory gleamed under the warm glow of chandelier light, reflecting a world built on prestige, discipline, and quiet arrogance. Professors in tailored suits and polished shoes moved through the grand hall like gatekeepers of talent, their voices low but sharp, their standards even sharper. Among them, almost invisible, was Lillian Porter. At 38, she moved with quiet efficiency, her soft gray cardigan and simple flats blending into the background as she dusted the polished black surface of a Steinway piano that cost more than most homes in the surrounding county. To them, she was just maintenance, a pair of hands that cleaned what greatness left behind. They never noticed how her fingers lingered for a fraction of a second longer on the keys, or how her eyes would narrow ever so slightly when a distant practice note echoed incorrectly down the hall. That morning carried a different tension. A high-profile recital was hours away, donors already filling the front rows, their tailored suits and pearl necklaces signaling expectations that could not be disappointed. Backstage, whispers moved fast. The star performer had fallen ill. Panic spread quietly but quickly, like a crack beneath polished glass. Professor Adrian Whitmore, head of performance, stood rigid near the stage entrance, his jaw tight, scanning the room for solutions that did not exist. That was when someone laughed, low and careless, suggesting the unthinkable as a joke. "Why not have her play?" a younger instructor muttered, nodding toward Lillian, who had just stepped in to replace a stack of sheet music. A few chuckles followed, not loud, but sharp enough to cut. Whitmore's eyes flicked toward her, calculating, not amused but not entirely dismissive either. In moments like these, desperation often disguises itself as opportunity. "You," he called, his voice echoing just enough to draw attention. Lillian paused, her posture straight, but her expression unreadable. The room shifted, subtle but noticeable, as several heads turned, curiosity mixing with quiet judgment. "You're familiar with the piano, aren't you?" he asked, though the tone made it clear the question was not meant to be taken seriously. A ripple of restrained laughter followed, the kind that doesn't need volume to humiliate. Lillian's hands tightened slightly around the cloth she held, but her voice, when it came, was steady. "A little," she replied. The answer only fueled their amusement. "Perfect," Whitmore said, a thin smile forming as he gestured toward the stage. "You can fill in. Just play something simple. We'll manage expectations." Manage expectations. The phrase hung in the air like a quiet insult dressed as professionalism. Around them, a few students exchanged glances, some uncomfortable, others entertained. To them, this was a spectacle in the making, a harmless moment of levity before the real performance resumed. No one noticed the way Lillian inhaled slowly, or how her gaze drifted briefly toward the grand piano waiting under the spotlight. No one recognized the shift happening behind her calm exterior, a memory awakening, something long buried rising with quiet certainty. As she stepped forward, the soft echo of her shoes against the marble floor seemed louder than before, each step measured, unhurried. Behind her, the whispers continued, low and dismissive, certain of what was about to happen. They believed they were about to watch a mistake unfold in real time. They had no idea they were about to witness something that would silence them completely. The backstage corridor felt narrower as Lillian approached the stage, the hum of conversation from the audience bleeding through the heavy velvet curtains like a distant storm waiting to break. Each step carried the weight of eyes she could not see yet could already feel, the quiet judgment of a room that had already decided who she was. Behind her, Professor Whitmore adjusted his cuffs with precise irritation, speaking in low tones to another instructor who barely bothered to hide his smirk. "Keep it brief," the man muttered. "We do not want this to turn into a spectacle." But it already was. Lillian paused just before the curtain, her hand brushing lightly against the polished wood of the piano bench as stagehands hurried past, their movements sharp with tension. No one offered her encouragement. No one asked if she was ready. To them, readiness was irrelevant. This was not about her success. It was about filling silence with something disposable. Across the hall, the audience shifted in their seats, the subtle rustle of expensive fabric and quiet conversation carrying an undercurrent of expectation that had not yet been adjusted. They had come for brilliance, for precision, for something worth remembering. What they were about to receive, they assumed, was a placeholder, a temporary inconvenience. The announcer's voice cracked slightly as he stepped forward, offering a carefully worded explanation about an unexpected change in the program. Polite applause followed, thin and uncertain, more out of courtesy than anticipation. Lillian stepped into the light. It was brighter than she remembered. Warmer, too, pressing gently against her skin as if testing her resolve. For a brief moment, she simply stood there, her figure framed against the grand piano that waited in silence, its black lacquer surface reflecting both her presence and the hundreds of faces watching her with mild curiosity or quiet dismissal. Somewhere in the second row, a woman leaned toward her companion and whispered something that ended in a soft laugh. Lillian did not react. She moved toward the bench with measured calm, her posture steady, her expression unchanged. The distance from curtain to piano was no more than 20 feet, yet it stretched into something far longer under the weight of expectation. As she sat down, the bench creaked faintly beneath her, the sound small but sharp in the otherwise controlled atmosphere. Her hands rested briefly in her lap, fingers still, as if listening. Not to the audience, not to the whispers, but to something deeper, something internal that had been silent for far too long. Backstage, Whitmore folded his arms, watching with a detached curiosity that bordered on impatience. He expected hesitation, perhaps even failure before the first note. That would justify everything. That would confirm what they already believed. A maintenance worker had no place here. The room held its breath without realizing it. Lillian lifted her hand slowly, hovering just above the keys. For a fraction of a second, there was uncertainty, not in her ability, but in the moment itself, in the decision to step forward when retreat would have been easier. Then something shifted. It was subtle, almost invisible, but real. Her shoulders relaxed, her spine aligned with a quiet confidence that did not belong to someone out of place. Her fingers lowered. The first note rang out, soft but precise, cutting cleanly through the air. It was not loud, not dramatic, but it was unmistakably intentional. A few audience members glanced at one another, their expressions changing ever so slightly. The second note followed, then a third, forming a pattern that felt deliberate, controlled, and far more refined than anyone had anticipated. The whispers began to fade, replaced by something else, something quieter, something closer to attention. Lillian did not look up. Her focus remained on the keys, her hands beginning to move with a fluidity that contradicted every assumption made about her just moments ago. Backstage, Whitmore's expression tightened, not yet alarmed, but no longer dismissive. He leaned forward slightly, as if trying to reconcile what he was hearing with what he believed to be true. Because the sound filling the hall was no longer convenient. It was no longer forgettable, and it was no longer something he could control. The melody did not hesitate. It unfolded with a quiet authority that began to reshape the atmosphere in the room. Each note placed with a precision that could not be faked or improvised. What had started as polite curiosity was now turning into something else. Entirely, something heavier, something that demanded attention. Lillian's fingers moved with increasing confidence, gliding across the keys not as someone attempting to survive a moment, but as someone reclaiming it. The piece she had chosen was not simple. It carried layers, subtle transitions, and emotional depth that required more than basic skill. It required understanding, and she understood it completely. In the front rows, a man who had been checking his watch slowly lowered his wrist, his gaze returning to the stage with a focus that had not been there before. A woman beside him leaned forward slightly, her expression tightening as recognition began to replace doubt. This was not luck. This was not an accident. Backstage, the shift was even more visible. Professor Whitmore's posture changed almost imperceptibly, his arms no longer folded in dismissal but hanging at his sides, his eyes fixed on Lillian with a growing intensity. The instructor who had suggested her as a joke earlier let out a quiet breath, his smirk fading into something uncertain. No one spoke. There was nothing to say that would not expose how quickly their assumptions were unraveling. On stage, Lillian remained composed, her breathing steady, her expression calm. But beneath that calm was something deeper, something that had been dormant for years. The memory of concert halls larger than this one, of audiences that had once risen to their feet, of a life that had been deliberately set aside. Each note she played carried not just technical mastery, but history, experience, discipline built over thousands of hours that no one in this room had ever witnessed. The tempo shifted, rising slightly, introducing a more demanding passage that required speed without sacrificing clarity. Her hands responded instantly, moving with a fluid precision that left no room for doubt. A quiet gasp rippled through a section of the audience, quickly suppressed but impossible to ignore. The room was changing. The same people who had moments ago dismissed her were now leaning forward, drawn in despite themselves, trying to understand what they were hearing. The sound filled the hall, rich and controlled, every phrase connected, every transition seamless. It was not just correct. It was expressive, intentional, alive. Backstage, Whitmore took a step closer to the curtain, his composure slipping just enough to reveal the tension beneath. This was no longer a temporary solution to a scheduling problem. This was a performance that could redefine the entire evening. And it was coming from someone he had not even considered worthy of acknowledgement. The realization settled slowly, heavily. He had miscalculated. Not in a small way, but completely. On stage, Lillian reached the midpoint of the piece, where the music softened, pulling back into a quieter, more delicate passage. Her touch changed instantly, the strength in her hands giving way to a gentle control that required even greater discipline. The audience followed her there, the room growing so still that the faint echo of each note could be heard as it faded into silence before the next began. No one shifted in their seats. No one whispered. The earlier laughter had disappeared entirely, replaced by a silence that was no longer casual but absolute. It was the kind of silence that only exists when something real is happening, when people recognize that they are witnessing something they cannot interrupt or dismiss. And in that silence, something else became clear. This was not a woman playing beyond expectations. This was a master revealing herself, one note at a time, in a place that had never thought to look for her. The music did not simply continue. It expanded, rising into a passage so intricate that even trained ears in the audience began to recognize its difficulty. A composition that demanded not only flawless technique, but emotional command, and Lillian delivered both with a quiet certainty that no longer asked for permission. Her hands moved faster now, yet nothing blurred, nothing rushed, each note landing with intention as if she had lived inside this piece long before this moment ever arrived. In the third row, a visiting donor who had funded multiple music programs leaned forward, his brows tightening as realization settled in. This was not a fortunate accident. This was elite mastery. A student seated near the aisle slowly lowered the program booklet from her lap, her eyes fixed on the stage, lips slightly parted as if trying to understand how someone they had all ignored could command such control. Backstage, the tension had shifted into something far less comfortable. Professor Whitmore stepped closer to the curtain, no longer hiding his focus, his mind racing through explanations that refused to align with what he was hearing. This level of performance did not come from casual familiarity. It came from years of disciplined training, from stages far beyond this one, from recognition that he, and everyone else in that building, had somehow overlooked. The instructor who had laughed earlier now stood completely still, his earlier confidence replaced by a quiet unease that crept across his face. No one dared speak. The silence backstage mirrored the silence in the hall, both spaces bound by the same undeniable truth. On stage, Lillian entered the most demanding section of the piece, where speed, precision, and emotional intensity collided. Her posture remained effortless, her shoulders relaxed, her wrists fluid, every movement economical yet powerful. There was no strain, no visible effort, only control. The notes cascaded like a controlled storm, filling the hall with a sound that was both commanding and deeply human. A woman in the front row pressed her hand lightly against her chest, overcome by a wave of emotion she had not expected to feel tonight. Another man, known for his critical standards, nodded slowly, almost unconsciously, acknowledging something he could not deny. The transformation in the room was complete. What had begun as polite tolerance had turned into full immersion. No one was waiting for this to end anymore. They were holding on to it, afraid to miss a single moment. Whitmore's jaw tightened as a deeper realization surfaced. Not just that Lillian was talented, but that she was extraordinary, and that he had placed her on that stage not as an opportunity, but as a dismissal. The weight of that mistake pressed heavier with each passing second. He glanced briefly at the other instructors, seeing in their expressions the same recognition, the same unspoken question. How had they not known? But the answer was already clear. They had never looked. On stage, the music began to shift again, building toward its final movement, where the energy gathered, tightened, and prepared to release. Lillian's expression remained calm, but there was a quiet intensity in her eyes now, something resolute, something that suggested this moment was not about proving them wrong, but about reclaiming something that had once been hers. The final sequence approached, a series of rapid transitions that required absolute precision. The audience leaned in collectively, the air in the room almost suspended, every breath held in anticipation. And then she played it, flawlessly, effortlessly, as if the complexity itself bowed to her command. The sound filled every corner of the hall, leaving no space untouched, no doubt unchallenged. Backstage, Whitmore exhaled slowly, the last trace of his earlier authority slipping into something quieter, something far less certain. Because what stood on that stage was not the woman they had underestimated. It was the standard they had failed to recognize. And in that moment, there was nothing left to question. Only the realization that everything they thought they understood had just been rewritten. The final notes did not end abruptly. They dissolved, each one lingering just long enough to leave an imprint before fading into a silence so complete it felt almost unreal. Lillian's hands remained on the keys for a brief moment after the last sound disappeared, her fingers still, her posture composed, as if she understood that what followed would not belong to her alone. The hall did not react immediately. There was no instant applause, no scattered clapping trying to fill the space. Instead, there was stillness, deep and absolute, the kind that settles only when something undeniable has just taken place. Dozens of faces stared toward the stage, not in confusion, but in quiet recognition. The same people who had arrived expecting a routine evening now found themselves sitting in the aftermath of something far more significant. In the front row, the donor who had leaned forward earlier slowly exhaled, his expression no longer analytical but reflective, as if recalibrating everything he thought he understood about the institution he supported. A student near the aisle blinked rapidly, her earlier skepticism replaced by admiration she could not hide. And then, almost imperceptibly, someone began to clap. It was soft at first, a single pair of hands breaking the silence with careful respect rather than excitement. Another followed. Then another. The sound built gradually, not chaotic, not forced, but steady, deliberate, growing into something unified. Within seconds, the entire hall was on its feet. The applause filled the space with a force that carried both awe and acknowledgement, a collective response that could not be restrained. It was not just appreciation for a performance. It was recognition of truth. Backstage, no one moved at first. Professor Whitmore stood frozen near the curtain, his gaze fixed on Lillian as the sound of applause reached him like a distant echo of consequence. The authority he had carried so effortlessly earlier now felt fragile, unsettled by a reality he had failed to anticipate. The instructor who had laughed earlier looked down briefly, avoiding eye contact with anyone around him, his earlier confidence replaced by something quieter, something closer to regret. Because there was no justification left, no explanation that could undo what had just happened. On stage, Lillian slowly lifted her hands from the keys and rose from the bench. She did not rush. She did not acknowledge the applause immediately. Instead, she turned slightly, her gaze moving across the audience, not searching for approval, but acknowledging presence. Her expression remained calm, unchanged, but there was a quiet strength in it now, something that had always been there but had never needed to be revealed. The applause continued, unwavering, filling every corner of the hall. And still, she did not bow right away, not out of defiance, but because this moment was not about proving them wrong. It was about standing fully in what had always been true. Backstage, Whitmore finally took a step forward, then stopped. For the first time, he hesitated. Not because he did not know what to say, but because he understood that anything he said would be too late. The hierarchy he had relied on, the assumptions he had trusted, had all been quietly dismantled in the span of a single performance. And there was nothing left to hide behind. On stage, Lillian inclined her head slightly, a small, respectful acknowledgement of the audience, and then stepped back from the piano. The applause did not fade. If anything, it grew stronger, more insistent, as if the room itself refused to let the moment end. But Lillian did not linger. She turned and began to walk toward the side of the stage, her steps as measured and calm as when she had first entered. There was no triumph in her movement, no attempt to claim the attention that had been given to her. Only quiet certainty. As she disappeared behind the curtain, the applause continued for several more seconds before slowly, reluctantly, beginning to settle. Conversations did not immediately resume. People remained standing, exchanging glances, each one aware that they had just witnessed something that would be remembered long after the evening ended. Backstage, the silence returned, but it was not the same silence as before. It was heavier now, filled with realization. Whitmore looked toward the space where Lillian had just exited, his expression no longer defined by authority, but by understanding. Because in a single moment, without raising her voice, without demanding recognition, she had redefined the entire room. And as the echoes of applause faded into memory, one truth remained, clear and undeniable. Respect had not been given to her that day. It had been earned in a way no one present would ever forget. The applause still echoed faintly in the distance as Lillian stepped into the quiet corridor behind the stage, the heavy door closing softly behind her, as if sealing the moment away from the world that had just witnessed it. The air back there felt different, cooler, stripped of the grandeur and expectation that filled the hall, and for the first time since she had sat at the piano, she allowed herself a slow breath. Her hands, steady just moments ago, now rested gently at her sides, the faint memory of the keys still lingering in her fingertips. Footsteps approached from behind, hesitant at first, then quicker, as if urgency had finally overcome hesitation. "Miss Porter," a voice called, controlled but strained. She paused, but did not turn immediately. Professor Whitmore came into view a second later, his usual composure carefully reconstructed but not fully intact. There was something unfamiliar in his expression now, something quieter, something that did not belong to the authority he had carried so confidently before. "I believe we need to speak," he said, his tone measured, though the weight behind it was unmistakable. Lillian turned slowly, her gaze steady, neither confrontational nor submissive. She simply looked at him. For a brief moment, Whitmore seemed to search for the right words, the silence between them stretching longer than he expected. This was not a conversation he had rehearsed. "That performance," he began, then stopped, as if even the word itself was insufficient. "You did not mention your background." It was not an accusation, not exactly, but it carried the remnants of one. Lillian's expression did not change. "You did not ask," she replied, her voice calm, even without edge. The words landed with quiet precision, leaving no room for argument. Whitmore inhaled slowly, the response settling in deeper than he intended. Around them, a few staff members lingered at a distance, pretending to be occupied but listening all the same. The atmosphere had shifted, and everyone could feel it. "This institution values excellence," Whitmore continued, regaining some of his formal tone, though it no longer held the same authority. "If we had known." He stopped again, realizing that the sentence no longer carried the weight it once would have. If they had known, they would have treated her differently. The implication was clear and uncomfortable. Lillian held his gaze for a moment longer, then spoke quietly. "Excellence does not change based on who is looking at it." There was no anger in her voice, no need to emphasize the point. It stood on its own. Whitmore's shoulders lowered slightly, the realization settling in fully. Now, this was not about a mistake in judgment during a single evening. This was about a pattern, a way of seeing people that had gone unquestioned for far too long. From the end of the corridor, The younger instructor who had laughed earlier approached slowly, his confidence replaced by a visible discomfort. I did not realize, he said, his words uneven, searching for footing that was no longer there. Lillian looked at him briefly, her expression neither dismissive nor forgiving, simply present. That is the point, she replied. The silence that followed was heavier than any applause, filled with understanding that did not require further explanation. No one attempted to interrupt it. No one tried to soften it. Because there was nothing to soften. Whitmore straightened slightly, as if preparing to reclaim some sense of control, but the effort felt incomplete. You should consider performing here, he said finally, the offer carefully constructed, though now lacking the power it once would have held. Under proper recognition. The phrase lingered, but its meaning had already shifted. Recognition, offered after the fact, carried a different weight. Lillian considered his words for a brief moment, not as an opportunity, but as a reflection of everything that had just unfolded. Then she shook her head gently. I already performed, she said. No emphasis, no dramatics. Just truth. Whitmore did not respond. There was nothing left to negotiate, nothing left to correct. The moment had already passed, and it had spoken clearly on its own. Lillian turned slightly, preparing to leave, her steps as calm as ever, her presence unchanged by the attention that had followed her performance. Behind her, the corridor remained still, the people within it quiet, each one holding onto the same realization in their own way. Because what had happened on that stage could not be undone, and more importantly, it could not be unseen. And as Lillian walked toward the exit, disappearing once again into the quiet space where she had always existed, one truth settled deeply into the minds of those left behind. Respect offered too late is not recognition, it is regret. The corridor did not return to normal after she left. It remained suspended in a quiet tension, as if the air itself had absorbed what had just happened and refused to release it. Professor Whitmore stood where she had left him, his posture still composed but no longer commanding, his gaze fixed on the empty space at the end of the hallway. For a man who had built his reputation on certainty, on the ability to assess talent within seconds, this moment offered something unfamiliar, doubt. Not loud, not dramatic, but persistent. Around him, the staff began to move again, though their motions were slower, more deliberate, as if each action required a second thought that had never been necessary before. The younger instructor who had laughed earlier remained near the wall, his arms folded tightly, not out of confidence, but as if holding something in place. He replayed the moment in his mind, the casual comment, the smirk, the assumption that had seemed harmless at the time. Now it felt different. Now it felt exposed. In the distance, the sound of the audience returning to their seats filtered faintly through the walls, the program attempting to continue. But something fundamental had shifted. Back in the main hall, conversations carried a different tone. Voices were lower, more reflective. People were no longer discussing the schedule or the missing performer. They were speaking about her. Not loudly, not with certainty, but with a kind of careful curiosity that bordered on reverence. Who is she? Someone asked quietly. No one had an answer, because no one had ever thought to ask before. A board member who had attended performances across the country sat still in his seat, his program untouched in his lap. He had spent years evaluating talent, funding institutions, shaping artistic direction, and yet he could not recall a moment that had unsettled him quite like this. Not because of what he had seen, but because of what he had missed. The realization was not comfortable. It rarely is when it arrives too late. Backstage, Whitmore finally exhaled, the breath slow and measured, as if releasing something he had been holding without realizing it. He turned slightly, looking at the others. Around him, and for the first time, there was no immediate instruction, no correction, no attempt to restore order. Because order, as he understood it, had already been disrupted. Find her file, he said quietly, though the words lacked their usual sharpness. There must be a record. But even as he spoke, the request felt insufficient. A file would not explain what they had witnessed. A title would not justify the oversight. Some things could not be documented in the way institutions preferred. They had to be recognized in the moment. And that moment had already passed. The younger instructor shifted slightly, his voice low. What if there is no file? The question lingered longer than expected. Whitmore did not respond immediately, because for the first time, he understood the possibility that someone could exist outside their system, outside their validation, and still surpass everything they believed defined excellence. It was not a comfortable thought. It challenged more than a single decision. It challenged the foundation itself. In the hallway beyond, the doors leading to the outside world opened briefly, letting in a trace of cooler evening air before closing again. Lillian was gone. Not in a dramatic sense, not in a way that demanded attention, but in the same quiet way she had always moved through the building. And yet, her absence now carried weight, because it was no longer invisible. It was noticeable. Back in the hall, the next performer stepped onto the stage, announced with careful professionalism, but the energy had changed. The audience listened, but not in the same way. There was comparison now, not spoken, but present. And it was not favorable. Not because the performer lacked skill, but because something real had already set a standard that could not be easily matched. Backstage, Whitmore adjusted his posture once more, attempting to reclaim the composure that had defined him for years. But something remained altered. A quiet awareness that could not be dismissed. He had seen excellence before. He had trained it, shaped it, elevated it. But this was different. This had existed without his influence, without his recognition, and had still risen above everything he controlled. And that realization did not fade. It settled. Because some lessons are not taught through instruction or authority. They arrive uninvited, undeniable, and once seen, they do not disappear. They remain, reshaping the way everything else is understood. The evening outside Holbrook Conservatory had settled into a calm, cool stillness, the kind that carried the quiet hum of distant traffic and the soft rustle of leaves along the tree-lined walkway. The building behind it still glowed with polished light, its tall windows reflecting an image of elegance and control that no longer felt entirely accurate. Inside, the program continued, but something essential had already slipped beyond its reach. Out here, away from the chandeliers and measured applause, Lillian walked without hurry, her steps steady against the concrete path, her presence once again blending into the ordinary world she had never truly left. There was no audience here, no expectation waiting to be fulfilled, only the familiar rhythm of a life that did not require recognition to have value. A few yards behind her, the glass doors opened again, and hurried footsteps broke the quiet. "Miss Porter," a voice called, slightly breathless, carrying urgency that had arrived too late. Lillian paused, turning just enough to acknowledge the sound without fully facing it. The younger instructor approached, his earlier arrogance replaced by something far more uncertain, something closer to sincerity. "I needed to find you," he said, his words careful, as if stepping into unfamiliar territory. "What happened in there? That was not something we can just let pass." Lillian regarded him quietly, her expression unchanged, her gaze steady in a way that made his next words feel heavier before he even spoke them. "You deserve to be recognized," he continued, the phrase sounding rehearsed, but not insincere. "We were wrong." The admission lingered between them, simple yet difficult, as if saying it out loud required more effort than expected. Lillian glanced briefly back at the building, its bright windows standing in contrast to the quiet darkness around them. "You were not looking," she said softly, not accusing, not dismissive, just stating what had always been true. The instructor nodded, slowly, as the meaning settled deeper than he had anticipated. "Then let us correct that," he replied, a trace of determination returning to his voice. "Come back tomorrow. Speak with the board. We can arrange something formal. A position, performances, whatever you want." The offer carried weight, the kind that would have meant everything in a different moment, under different circumstances. But the moment had already passed. Lillian considered him for a brief second, not weighing the opportunity, but recognizing what it represented. Not discovery, but reaction. Not belief, but realization after proof. "What you are offering now," she said quietly, "is not the same as what you withheld before." The words were not harsh, but they did not soften the truth either. The instructor exhaled, the response settling in with a clarity he could not ignore. Behind him, the building remained unchanged in appearance, but something within it had shifted in a way that could not be undone. He looked back at her, searching for something that might change the outcome, but finding none. "Then what happens now?" he asked, the question more genuine than anything he had said before. Lillian turned fully this time, her gaze calm, her posture relaxed, as if the answer did not require effort. "Now you remember," she said. The simplicity of it carried more weight than any explanation. He stood there for a moment, absorbing the words, understanding slowly that this was not about a missed opportunity to recruit talent. It was about a missed opportunity to recognize it when it mattered. Lillian gave a small nod, not as farewell, but as acknowledgement, and then turned again, continuing down the path without hesitation. The sound of her footsteps faded gradually, blending into the quiet of the evening until there was nothing left to follow. The instructor remained where he was, the glow from the conservatory behind him casting long shadows across the ground. His reflection caught briefly in the glass before disappearing as the doors closed once more. Inside, the music played on, but outside, something far more lasting had already been decided. Because recognition that comes after the world has already seen the truth is not a reward. It is a reminder. And that night, Holbrook Conservatory did not gain a new performer. It gained something far more difficult to ignore, the understanding that excellence does not wait to be invited, and dignity does not need permission to be seen. The night had deepened by the time the final guests began to leave Holbrook Conservatory, their conversations quieter now, less certain, as if each step down the marble stairs carried with it a thought they could not quite put into words. The glow from the tall windows softened against the dark sky, no longer a symbol of unquestioned prestige, but something more reflective, something that held the memory of what had unfolded inside. In the days that followed, the story spread, not through official statements or carefully crafted announcements, but through quiet conversations, passing remarks, and the kind of retelling that grows stronger with each voice that carries it. A woman no one had noticed had stepped onto a stage that defined excellence, and without introduction, without recognition, she had redefined it. Within the conservatory, the shift was subtle but undeniable. Faculty meetings grew quieter, not because there was less to say, but because there was more to consider. The certainty that once guided decisions now carried hesitation, a second thought that had not existed before. Files were reviewed more carefully, not just for credentials, but for what might have been overlooked. Names that once would have been dismissed were now given a moment longer, a glance that lingered where it had not before. Professor Whitmore remained at the center of it all, his presence still commanding, but altered. He spoke with the same precision, the same measured tone, yet something beneath it had changed. There was a pause now, brief but real, before judgment was passed. A space where doubt had been allowed to exist. He never spoke publicly about that evening, never referenced it in lectures or discussions, but it was there, woven quietly into the way he listened, into the way he observed. Because once a man like him sees the limits of his own certainty, he cannot return to it unchanged. The younger instructor who had once laughed found himself lingering longer in practice rooms, listening not just for perfection, but for something deeper. He no longer dismissed the unfamiliar so quickly. He asked questions he had never thought to ask before, not out of obligation, but out of a realization that talent does not always announce itself in the ways they expect. Outside those walls, Lillian continued her life with the same quiet rhythm she had always maintained. There were no headlines, no interviews, no sudden transformation into a public figure. She returned to the spaces that had never required her to prove anything, where the value of her presence was not measured by recognition, but by consistency, by purpose. And yet, something had changed, not in her, but in the way the world had briefly seen her. The stage had not given her anything new. It had simply revealed what had always been there. Occasionally, someone who had been in that audience would pass her on the street, their expression shifting with recognition, a quiet pause, a moment where they considered speaking, then chose not to. Not out of indifference, but out of respect. Because some moments are not meant to be interrupted once they have been understood. Back at the conservatory, the grand piano remained in its place, polished, perfect, waiting for the next performance. Students continued to practice, to strive, to chase the standard they had been taught to recognize. But somewhere in that hall, in the echo of a memory that refused to fade, a different standard lingered. One that could not be measured by titles or positions. One that did not wait for permission to exist. And on certain evenings, when the room grew still between rehearsals, When the last note faded just before the next began, there was a silence that felt familiar, not empty, but full, as if the space itself remembered. Because that night had not been about a performance. It had been about truth appearing where it was least expected, about dignity standing quietly in a place that had never thought to look for it. And long after the applause had faded, long after the doors had closed and the lights had dimmed, one lesson remained, steady and unshaken. The world does not decide who you are. It only reveals whether it was paying attention.